I am 32 years old, and for the past 5 years my family has celebrated every single holiday here. You mentioned Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, and Memorial Day. My house is always where my family gets together if there is a purpose for it. It wasn't always like this, but following my grandmother's death, I seemed to default in the host capacity. Her house is nothing special, but it has a large enough living room and dining area to suit everyone. She had entertained for almost 30 years, and everyone just expected I would start up where she left off. It's hardly a mansion, but it suits events. Ryan, my 35-year-old older brother, lives close in a similarly sized house, but hosting has never been discussed with him. Ryan married with 2 young children. Anytime the thought of him hosting comes up, he dismisses it with, "Our house is too chaotic for something like that." Over the years, our family has expanded. A normal holiday involves roughly 20 people jammed into my house. Cousins have children now. Aunts and uncles are getting older. It is loud, dirty, and really overpowering. My family enjoys my cooking, decor, and attempts to create a warm and inviting atmosphere akin to that of my grandmother used to. I've even gone out of my way to preserve some of her customs, buying unique tablecloths, new lights for Christmas, and elegant serving dishes that gather dust until the holidays roll around. But the expenses keep mounting. Hosting has become a financial black hole between food, beverages, decorations, and small extras to keep the children occupied. I sat down last year and worked on the math. Every spare dollar seems to go into these events, so what I spent on celebrating one holiday might have paid a great trip for myself, something I haven't done in years. Around this time last year, I decided to ask my family for a little help. Nothing significant, just maybe bringing a side dish or dining in. Thinking it would be a quick chat, I brought it up haphazardly one evening after dinner. Rather, the room turned completely quiet. Everybody just watched me as though I had committed some kind of familial betrayal. My mother abruptly switched the topic. Ryan joked about me being Mr. Moneybags, and it marked the end of it. Thank you Thanksgiving last year. I knew then that I was still paying for everything while the most anyone provided was a store-bought pie they had picked on the way over. Everyone showed there, ate, drank, and caught up with one another as I scurried about like a headless chicken, making sure the turkey didn't burn and that drinks stayed full. My dishwasher stopped part through the night, so I had to hand-wash mounds of dishes till almost 2 in the morning. It dawned on me then just how little I genuinely like the holidays now when my family left early, all stating they were too tired to stay and help clean up. These events provide my family an opportunity to unwind and reconnect. I find it to be a full-time employment. The worst thing is not even the time or money, it's the expectations. I get up at the crack of dawn to start cooking, and by the time the last meal is packed away, the day is gone and I have hardly had a moment to sit down. My mother dismisses every time I propose that someone else host, or that we try something else with remarks like, "But you're so excellent at it." I gently brought it up around Christmas, saying something like, "Maybe it's time for someone else to take over." My mom just smiled and said, "Where else would we go?" Ryan naturally did not offer his house. He only nodded in line, not really relevant to him. He simply doesn't want the hassle, not as though he could host. I'm left managing credit card debt, trying to meet everyone's expectations in the meantime. I can't help but be bitter. I've persuaded myself for years that it's worth it to keep the family together, but now I'm beginning to doubt if that's really true. Though for me, the holidays have become a cause of anxiety rather than celebration. I've been postponing a meaningful conversation with my family, largely due to my knowledge of their response. Given their extreme traditionalism, my parents would definitely view me as turning away the family legacy. But this is about how underappreciated I feel, not only about the money or the work anymore. Years of devoting everything I have to these meetings have gone toward nothing except pressure instead of thanks. I cannot keep on doing this. Should I fail to adjust soon, I will find myself much more resentful of my family. I have to put myself first, even if it means upsetting the balance at this point. At last I decided to take off the Band-Aid. I just hope they can grasp, or at least attempt to, before it's too late. To have the face-to-face chat, I asked Ryan and my parents to brunch at my house. I reasoned that being personally free from distractions would make it simpler to explain everything. I went all out with the food, eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, the entire work. Before I broke the news, I wanted the atmosphere to be light. When they arrived, everything appeared natural. Ryan was fixated on his phone as his kids were playing in the corner. My mom asked about my neighbor's new dog, and my dad mentioned his golf game. Like every Sunday morning after we ate, I cleared my throat and informed them I needed to discuss the holidays. Ryan stopped scrolling, and my mother's smile vanished right away. My dad kept eating, but I could see the interest in his eyes. I plunged in to say that I was finding hosting to be too much. I discussed the expenses, how I had been running everything on my credit card, and how I hadn't been able to enjoy the holidays personally. Silence prevailed for a brief instant. My dad then waved his hand dismissively and remarked, "It's not a major issue." I attempted to clarify that it was the time and effort as much as the money the family could donate this year. I reminded them of how I was caught washing dishes until 2 in the morning and of the dishwasher failing last Thanksgiving, whereas everyone else unwinded. Her face tightened in that manner it always does when she finds something unacceptable. She stepped in, discussing how my grandmother hosts every year without ever grumbling and how it keeps the family close. I tried to keep cool and explain that times are different now. She thought of the coziness of my grandma's house, the customs, and how well I had carried on that legacy. While juggling a full-time work, my grandma did not have to accommodate 20 guests. Back then, the expenses were not what they are today. Ryan responded simply the same passive attitude he usually had. He was obviously indifferent, and murmured something about figuring it out. He did not offer any answers. When I mentioned that maybe he and his wife should host this year, he immediately evaded. With the children? Then my mother tried a different approach, as our location is not fit for something like that. She began talking about how much the children love Christmas at my house, how their eyes sparkle when they see my decorations, and how much they would miss if we changed things. Though the guilt trip was clear-cut, I inhaled deeply, trying to keep my tone consistent. I said again that I wanted a break and advised we rotate housekeeping responsibility. The space grew frigid. Under his breath, my brother said something about some people just not being generous, and it stung more than I wanted to acknowledge. The atmosphere was entirely off by the time they departed. Ryan hardly bid farewell. My folks left quickly. Feeling annoyed, I vented to a few friends who helped me to relax after receiving a lengthy text from my mother, guilt-tripping me about how much the holidays mean to the family and how I'm breaking tradition. One of them that I post about it on Reddit, so I did. Keeping it anonymous, I described the complete circumstances on one of those family drama subs. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Many of the hundreds of comments I received urged me to stick to my values and that the expectations of my family were unreasonable. People related their own tales of the same circumstances, which lessened my loneliness. A few people wrote me selfish remarks, but the general support gave me hope. I knew there would be more turmoil ahead, but I was done letting my family push me about. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't crazy for wanting to create boundaries. It was time to put myself first. I knew the storm was approaching. I simply had no idea how quickly it would strike after breakfast. A few days later, out of the blue, my 29-year-old cousin Emily contacted me. We have always got along well, but we hardly interact outside of family events. So when her name showed up on my phone, I assumed something was wrong. She did not waste time. "So I have been hearing things," she stated. "Ryan and his wife are unhappy about you withdrawing from hosting." Hearing her say it out loud felt like a hit to the belly. "They have been telling members of the family you are being selfish." Though I hadn't expected Ryan to be happy about my choice, I didn't believe he would go as far as labeling me as the evil guy to the rest of the family. Emily was not sugar-coated about it. She said, "They're making it sound like you're the one breaking the family apart." I tried to be cool and dismiss it as not bothering me, but it did. I had spent years stooping backwards to celebrate these festivals, and now I was the villain. Emily was, all things considered, helpful. "Honestly, I understand why you're pulling back," she remarked. "I'm not sure how you've managed this for such a lengthy period without support. Nobody usually stays to tidy things." The drama truly erupted in the family group chat a few days later. It was affirming to hear someone in the family admit what I had been experiencing, but it did not lessen Ryan's remarks. It began with a vague note from my mother about how much she would miss our usual Christmas at my place. She omitted me personally, but everyone understood what she meant. Aunts and cousins were chipping in within minutes with remarks like, "It just won't be the same." "We've always had such amazing holidays there," I said, not responding. I was unable. Every communication seemed to be another stone in the guilt wall they were building around me. Emily messaged me personally later. "They are being ridiculous," she remarked. "Try not to let them get you down. You're right to want a break." Emily let something slip that had my fury boiling that same evening. "Oh, by the way, Ryan and his wife have a trip to Europe next summer. They had been saving for it." I felt as though the breeze had been knocked out of me. Ryan, the same individual who behaved selfishly seeking assistance with Christmas bills, was saving for a luxurious vacation. The hypocrisy troubled me more than the trip itself. He could afford to fly the globe, but he missed Christmas. I decided to wait even though I argued right then and there about facing him. The pressure from my parents never stopped. I needed time to cool off and find what to say without aggravating the issue. My mother would phone every couple of days to inquire whether I had changed my mind about hosting. She would draw the same boundaries regarding family customs and the significance of the holidays to everyone every time. One night, after yet another call from her, I sat down with all the receipts and credit card bills from the preceding 5 years, like she thought if she persisted long enough. I totaled all I had spent on food, decorations, presents, every dollar used to create these festivities. I became ill upon seeing the whole figure. For a down payment on an automobile, it was plenty. Year after year, I had been running down my money account for what? My family could thus have a good dinner and leave me to clean the mess. It served as a summons to wakefulness. In the thick of all this, Emily came through with a recommendation. I was being taken advantage of, not simply burned out. This year, she volunteered to have a little Christmas meal at her house. "It doesn't have to be a large production," she remarked. "Just something different to take the pressure off you." I valued the offer and chose to bring the concept before my parents. I reasoned that they could come to embrace the change if they saw someone else ready to take action. They shot it down right away when I brought it up, though. "It just wouldn't be the same," my mother remarked. "Christmas belongs at your place." They hardly gave it any thought. Eventually, I chose to face Ryan. It was as though they had already agreed that anything less than a flawless holiday at my house was not worth having. Though I intended to keep it laid back, I couldn't deny the mounting strain between us. He reacted defensively right away when I mentioned the vacation. "What then has bearing on anything?" He crossed his arms and asked. "We have been saving for that trip for years." I told him I was not upset about the vacation itself. I just thought it was hypocritical for him to call me selfish when he obviously had the means to help out with the holidays. "It's not the same thing," he added. "We have been long planning this trip." We talked back and forth for a bit, but it was obvious he didn't see my perspective. "You're making it sound like we're hoarding money, and that's not fair." He maintained that I was the one causing problems, and that I was overreacting. I was more annoyed than ever by the time the chat stopped. Things between us become uncomfortable afterwards. In family get-togethers, we hardly spoke. When we did, the exchanges were tense and brief. Though I could sense my parents were tense, they said nothing. They most likely attributed it to my refusal to host. As the weeks passed, guilt trips and conflicts began to grind me down. Every time the holidays arrived, it became a quarrel or some passive-aggressive remark about how things used to be. I knew I couldn't back down even though I was tired from always defending myself. If I gave in, I would find myself just where I had begun late one night, seated down to create another Reddit post. I had to get it all out, the group chat turmoil, Ryan's hypocrisy, my parents' constant pressure. The answer came right away and was essentially favorable. People told me I wasn't insane for sticking to my ground, and they related tales of their own battles with family expectations. The comments reminded me of something crucial. Setting limits is difficult but essential. It also encouraged me to realize I wasn't alone. The holidays were soon approaching, and I still didn't know how everything would go if I gave in now instead of standing strong. Though I knew there would be more drama, I resolved not to let it trip me. I was not about to stop now. This was the first time in years I was putting myself first. Though things turned around later, I considered the aftermath from the group chat and my conversation with Ryan as the worst of it. Halfway through catching up on a TV show, one Saturday afternoon I was relaxing on my couch when I heard a knock at the door. Since I expected no one, I assumed it was a delivery or perhaps a neighbor. But my parents were standing there when I opened the door. They hadn't texted, phoned, or warned me of anything. My dad stood behind my mother, arms crossed like he was preparing for a discussion, while she had that look, the one she gets when she is ready to start a serious discourse. They entered right in, sitting in my living room, as they had been practicing this moment all day. My mom looked around, her eyes glancing over the absence of holiday preparation, before I could say anything. Normally by now, I would have decorations all around, lights draped across the mantel, garlands on the stairs, my tree in the corner, but not this year. My mother remarked, seated on the couch's edge, "We need to talk. This year I hadn't even pulled the boxes out of storage." I grumbled and moved to sit across from my dad. "What's this about?" Though I already knew, I inquired. My mother started a moving speech on family customs and the significance of our all staying near for her. She mentioned how much it had meant to her to do what Grandma had done year after year. "It's not only about the food or the decorations," she replied, her voice rich with feeling. She even mentioned early recollections, detailing how Grandma used to build up her Christmas town and how everyone would gather into her small living room, so preserving the family together. She once took out an old photo album she had brought along and turned through images of former holidays. Like she thought displaying these memories would change my viewpoint, it felt like a visual guilt trip. My dad, quiet up to this point, suddenly chipped in. "If you're not willing to host this year," he advised, "maybe the family shouldn't celebrate Christmas at all. Given that we cannot all be together, what good is it?" Dazed, I fixed my gaze on him. Was he implying that Christmas might just be canceled if I did not host? Something inside of me caught fire. For weeks I had been holding back, chewing my tongue through every passive-aggressive remark and guilt trip. But this is different. Too much of this was involved. Leaching forward, my voice more shrill than I had intended, I blurted, "I'm done being treated like the family's holiday planner. I have spent years devoting time, money, and effort to organize these events. It has never been sufficient." My parents immediately glanced at me, shocked. "I'm not only a host, I'm also part of this family, but I don't feel like it." Tears welled up in my mom's eyes, and my dad's jaw locked. Though I wasn't finished, I could see he was about to fight. "I've been trying to tell you for months that I need a break," I added. "This is about how much this has taken from me, not about undermining customs. I cannot keep doing this." My mother began to cry, gently at first, then louder as she spoke. Holding a tissue from her purse, she remarked, "I just feel like the family is falling apart. I thought you cared about keeping us all together." Her comments stung more than I would have wanted to admit. I did care. That was the main reason I had pushed myself so rigorously for so long. But I got up and grabbed the folder where I had been collecting my receipts and credit card statements from past Christmas, determined not to let that guilt triumph this time. I arranged them before them on the coffee table. "Look at the totals," I remarked, pointing. "I have spent this on food, decor, beverages, gifts, everything, not even considering the time I have invested." They both silently gazed at the data. My dad looked truly mute for a minute, and my mom stopped crying. But it did not last. My dad waved a lazy hand. "It's not about the money," he remarked. "This relates to family and about keeping us near. You are focusing all of this on yourself. That strikes a chord." "How am I relating this to myself?" I asked, my voice growing louder. "No one else has volunteered to preserve these customs. I have spent years giving time and money to do so. I only ask for a little fairness, rotate hosting responsibilities, chip in for food, whatever." My dad shook his head, murmuring something about how I would regret this. Instead, I am being called selfish, for at last saying enough is enough. My mother only stared at me, glumly glassy. She said little as they got ready to go, but her obvious displeasure was clear. They left without saying goodbye, and I felt a weird mix of relief and grief as I watched them depart. Even though I knew I had done the right thing, it still hurt to see how offended people were. That evening, I uploaded another update on Reddit. I wrote on the intervention, the conflict, and how I finally presented it for my parents. Once more, the remarks were rather favorable. One comment stayed with me. The hardest part about setting boundaries is watching the people you love struggle with them. People told me I wasn't crazy for maintaining my ground and offered their own tales about creating boundaries with challenging family members. Still, you are acting morally here. That sentence really struck me, since boundaries mean you care about yourself too. Not that you don't care. I had convinced myself for years that caring looked like putting my family first. Perhaps, though, it was reasonable to worry for myself as well. The weeks before Christmas were calm, too subdued. Ryan stayed far off, my parents never called, and the family group chat was essentially dead. I had no idea if they had chosen to proceed without me, or if they were all waiting for me to cave. In both cases, I was not going to get in touch. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. Still, the silence tormented me. Though I really wanted to put myself first, I detested the idea that I might have irreparably strained my bonds with my family. I also knew, though, that the solution was not yielding in. They never would have accepted my limits now. I resolved to follow my plan. A quiet Christmas, just me and some takeaways. Not hosting, not drama, not guilt. Though not the holiday I had in mind, at least it would be on my own schedule. Christmas Eve rolled along, and for the first time in years, my house was empty. Not lights, not decorations, not stacks of food ready in the kitchen. I had decided to follow my plan. No hosting, no obligations, just a quiet day with some takeout and a stack of Christmas movies. I had just sat down with a plate of dumplings when my phone buzzed. Emily stood there. "Hey," the note said, "I have a little supper tomorrow. A few cousins and the children only. Wanna come?" I hesitated first. Spending Christmas alone had become second nature to me, so I honestly wasn't sure I wanted to risk a family conflict. Emily persisted, though, arguing that without me, things would not be the same. I believed I owed at least that much after everything she had done to help me through this situation. "Okay," I said. Emily's apartment was small, but unlike the extravagant settings I used to build. A basic Christmas tree in the corner, some wall decorations, and a table loaded with dishes everyone had contributed. Though less polished, more laid back, it felt fantastic. It felt less like a performance. There were just a few of us, Emily, her husband, their 2 children, and a couple of cousins living nearby. With none of the normal pressure associated with our holiday meetings, everyone appeared content to be there. People brought handmade dishes, casseroles, pies, cookies, and there was a warmth to it that I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't going back and forth from the kitchen, worried about whether the turkey was dry or whether we would run out of drinks. Just sitting here, said laughter. That turned out to be a revelation. Just when I thought the night couldn't surprise me anymore, Ryan walked up. He hadn't mentioned anything about coming, so seeing him walk through the door shocked me. I had no idea how much I had missed being part of the party instead of organizing it. Unusual for him, he left his wife and children behind. With hands in his pockets, he simply stepped in looking uncomfortable and uncertain. "Hey," he began, giving me a little nod. "Hey," I answered, trying to interpret his expression. He seemed uncomfortable, as though he didn't know whether he was welcome. Ryan pulled me aside after dinner, when everyone else was chatting in the living room. Emily grabbed him a plate and escorted him to the table. We all acted as like it was nothing. Since our dispute, this was the first one-on-one we had. I wasn't sure what to expect. "I owe you an apology," he continued, his voice subdued. I suppose I responded too strongly. His comments startled me, as I had no idea how much labor hosting involved. The things he had said had caused weeks of rage and hurt, but seeing him confess it helped me to soften something in me. Still, I couldn't let him off completely. "What about the vacation?" I inquired. You wouldn't have thought it looked poor to be complaining about helping out while you were saving for a luxury trip." Ryan groaned and shuffled his feet. "Indeed, that timing was quite poor. We have years of savings. I never considered how it would present." I nodded, enjoying his candor. I wasn't trying to disguise anything. I just wanted it to seem like I was putting it in your face. "I'm not crazy about the trip," I said. "I just wanted my choice to be valued." Ryan, I felt like a break. He nodded carefully, as though he were truly listening for the first time, not about destroying customs, but about maintaining my sanity. He replied, "I get it. Indeed, you are correct. Perhaps we could have made more pitches. Though there wasn't a perfect answer, it felt like development. I will discuss with everyone making things fair next year." I felt Ryan knew where I was coming from for the first time, and the remainder of the evening seemed lighter. Ryan and I came back into the group, and our conflict appeared to have lessened. Though there were still problems we had to go through, it felt like the first step toward mending. My parents, as predicted, did not reach out on Christmas Day. Though I had become ready for that, it still hurt. They had made such a great deal about family spending holidays years before, but now they were quiet. That night, once I returned home, I sat down and penned another Reddit update, trying not to obsess too much and instead concentrate on the friendliness of Emily's gathering. I discussed the dinner at Emily's, Ryan's apologies, and how the evening had seemed like a little but significant triumph. People urged me to keep establishing limits and celebrating my development. One message in particular stayed with me. Boundaries don't mean you're shutting people out. They imply that you are inviting them in under terms that fit you personally. Your brother seems to be beginning to see it. It was a viewpoint I had not before given any thought. Perhaps this was about recreating the family in a way that avoided crushing me under the weight of expectations, rather than about severing the family. As I went to bed that evening, I sensed tranquility I hadn't felt in years. Though the holidays have usually caused tension and annoyance, this year I found something different. Though not flawless, it was real. And for the first time, I truly looked forward to what was ahead. New Year's Day rolled around, and my phone called as I was finishing off housekeeping from a small get-together with friends. It was my mother. I stopped momentarily, not sure if I wanted to respond. After everything that had happened, I didn't know if I was ready for another round of guilt trips or accusations, but something in her voice when I picked it up felt different, quieter, less sharp. She didn't waste time. "Can we come over and talk?" she asked. "Your dad and I just want to understand, really understand how you're feeling." There was a hesitation in her tone that caught me off guard. This wasn't the mom who stormed into my house with old photo albums to make a point. This was someone trying, in her own way, to make things right. I agreed, but set a clear boundary. Only if it's a calm conversation. I'm not doing this again if it's just more guilt. She agreed, and later that afternoon my parents showed up. This time it wasn't like before. My mom wasn't carrying props to guilt trip me, and my dad wasn't crossing his arms like he was ready for a fight. They both looked nervous, like they weren't sure where to start. We sat in the living room, and after a few moments of awkward silence, my mom began. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I didn't realize how much we've been taking you for granted. We just thought you were okay with it because you never said anything before." It wasn't the full apology I'd been hoping for, but it was a start. My dad nodded, adding, "We didn't mean to make you feel like you were alone in all this. That wasn't fair." I was still cautious, unsure if this was genuine or just an attempt to smooth things over. But then my mom surprised me. She started talking about how hard it had been for her after my grandma passed, and how keeping the holiday traditions alive made her feel like she was holding on to a piece of my grandma. "I guess I clung to it too tightly," she admitted. "When you took over hosting, it felt like you were keeping her memory alive. I didn't stop to think about what it was costing you." Hearing her say that was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. For years, I'd assumed they didn't care about how much I was struggling. Now I realized it wasn't that they didn't care, they just didn't see it. I took a deep breath and shared my side. I told them about the financial strain, the exhaustion, and the feeling of being taken for granted. I love this family, I said. I love the holidays. But the way things have been, it doesn't feel like I'm part of the celebration. It feels like I'm just the one making it happen. My mom teared up again, but this time it wasn't out of anger. I'm sorry, she said. I never wanted you to feel that way. My dad, always the more practical one, suggested a compromise. Maybe we need to rethink how we do the holidays, he said. What if we had smaller gatherings throughout the year instead of putting all the pressure on one person at Christmas? My mom hesitated for a moment, but then she nodded. That might be nice, she said. And it doesn't have to be all on you anymore. In the middle of this conversation, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ryan. My mom had told him they were coming over, and he wanted to join the conversation. Virtually, at least. I wasn't sure how I felt about that, but I figured it was better to include him than risk another misunderstanding. On the call, Ryan surprised me again. He offered to host a family barbecue in the summer as a way to start spreading out the hosting duties. It's not a holiday, he said, but it's something. We can rotate from there. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it felt like progress. For the first time, it seemed like everyone was starting to understand that I couldn't keep carrying the weight of the holidays on my own. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about ways to make future holidays more manageable. My parents still looked a little disappointed when I reiterated that I wouldn't be hosting every holiday anymore. But this time, they didn't argue. They seemed to accept it, even if it wasn't what they wanted to hear. When they left, I felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. I was glad we'd had the talk and that they'd apologized, but I knew that real change would take time. It's one thing to agree in the moment. It's another to follow through when the next holiday rolls around. That night, I posted one final update on Reddit. I shared how the conversation had gone, the compromises we'd reached, and the progress we'd made. The responses were overwhelming, as always. People told me they were proud of me for standing my ground, and that it sounded like my family was finally starting to get it. One comment stood out. Setting boundaries isn't about shutting people out. It's about inviting them in on terms that respect your needs. It sounds like your family is finally learning that. It gave me hope that things could get better, even if it wouldn't happen overnight. As I looked ahead to the new year, I felt more grounded than I had in a long time. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be perfect. There'd still be moments of tension and frustration. But for the first time, I felt like my family was starting to meet me halfway. And that was more than I dared to hope for. In the weeks after that conversation with my parents and Ryan, I noticed a subtle shift in the family dynamic. The group chat, which had been so tense and passive-aggressive before Christmas, started to feel normal again. Ryan even initiated a conversation about his summer barbecue plans, asking for input on dates and ideas for food. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like progress. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the weight of family gatherings was solely on my shoulders. And while I knew we still had work to do, I started to feel hopeful that things were changing for the better. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected call from my mom. She asked if I had time to go for coffee, just the two of us. There's something I want to talk about, she said. Her tone was different, not guilt-tripping or defensive, but open and almost apologetic. We met at a little cafe near my house, and after some small talk, she got straight to the point. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, she began, about how much you've done for the family and how we haven't always appreciated it. I waited, unsure of where this was going. I realized that I've been holding on too tightly to the way things used to be, she admitted. When Grandma passed, I felt like I had to keep everything exactly the same. I thought if we let go of those traditions, we'd lose her too. But I see now that I've been unfair to you. I've put too much on you, and I'm sorry. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so much time feeling resentful and unappreciated that I hadn't stopped to consider how much she was carrying too. It didn't excuse everything, but it helped me understand where she was coming from. I appreciate that, Mom, I said. I get why the traditions are so important to you, but I can't do it all on my own anymore. I need the family to meet me halfway. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I know, she said, and we will, I promise. True to her word, things started to shift. Ryan's barbecue in the summer was the first real test, and to my surprise, he followed through. He hosted the event at his house, handling the food, drinks, and setup. It wasn't perfect, his kids kept running underfoot, and the grill caught fire for a second, but it was a success. For once, I got to be a guest instead of the host, and it felt amazing. My parents pitched in too. My dad brought his famous potato salad, and my mom helped with cleanup afterward. It was a small step, but it showed me they were serious about changing the dynamic. When Thanksgiving rolled around, we tried something new. Instead of one person hosting, we split the responsibilities. Emily offered to host at her place. Ryan handled the turkey. My parents brought side dishes, and I handled drinks and desserts. It wasn't the traditional setup we'd grown up with, but it worked. And for the first time in years, I actually got to sit down and enjoy the meal without worrying about whether the stuffing was burning or the drinks needed refilling. Christmas was the real test. My parents, still holding on to some of their old habits, suggested having it at my house again, but I stood firm. I'm happy to help, I told them, but I'm not hosting. To my surprise, Ryan volunteered to host Christmas dinner. We'll make it work, he said, waving off any concerns about his kids or the chaos. And he did. The kids were loud, the dog knocked over the tree once, and the turkey came out a little dry, but nobody cared. We were together, and that was what mattered. Looking back, I realized that setting boundaries wasn't just about saying no. It was about creating space for other people to step up and share the load. It wasn't easy. There were fights, guilt trips, and moments when I doubted myself, but in the end, it was worth it. My family had started to understand that I couldn't keep doing everything, and I'd learned to advocate for myself in ways I never had before. On New Year's Eve, I posted a final update on Reddit, summarizing how the year had gone. I talked about the small victories, Ryan hosting Christmas, the shared effort at Thanksgiving, my mom's apology, and how it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. The responses were overwhelmingly supportive, with people sharing their own stories of family dynamics and encouraging me to keep holding firm to my boundaries. One comment stood out. Sometimes the hardest part of setting boundaries isn't the pushback, it's sticking to them when the guilt creeps in. But it sounds like you've done that, and your family is better for it. They were right. It hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could actually look forward to the holidays instead of dreading them. Now, as I sit in my living room, peaceful and quiet, I feel a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the progress my family has made, but for the lessons I've learned along the way. I've learned that boundaries don't mean shutting people out. They mean inviting people in, but on terms that are healthy for everyone involved. I've learned that it's okay to put myself first sometimes, even when it's uncomfortable. And I've learned that change is possible, even in the most stubborn families. This next chapter of my life feels lighter, freer, and full of possibility. And as I look ahead, I know one thing for sure. I'm ready for whatever comes next, because I've finally taken back control of my own story.